Warm Georgetown welcome to all of you. My name is Mehran Kamrava. I'm professor of government here. It's a distinct pleasure and an honor to welcome back to Georgetown, Qatar, an old friend and one of the most brilliant scholars. And I really mean that. I just told my students, and I didn't say it with admiration, I said it with a fair amount of jealousy. One of the most astute observers of Iran and the Arab world that I've had the pleasure of reading. I first learned about Daniel Brumberg through his book that was published in 2001 called Reinventing Khomeini. And one of the remarkable facts about the book was that it was the product of field work and the time that Dan spent in Iran, rather than just sitting in his air-conditioned office at Georgetown in Washington, writing about Iran, or any other country, which tends to be popular among some of us. He is really a very astute observer of the Middle East. And over the years, I have always learned from his writings. Dan Brumberg is professor of government at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. If I were to tell you all of his accomplishments and accolades, would be here all night, but let me just very quickly say that he's senior non-resident fellow at the Arab Center, Washington, D.C. From 2008 to 2015, he served as special advisor to the United States Institute of Peace. In addition to his position at Georgetown, he has served as visiting professor of Kuwait Gulf Studies at Sciences Po in Paris, and he continues to serve as a faculty member for the St. Martin Georgetown University program in public policy in Buenos Aires. Today, Dan will talk to us about Hamas's Al-Aqsa flood and Iran's axis of resistance. And he has kindly agreed to take some questions afterwards.
Absolutely.
So please join me in welcoming Dan Brumberg.
Thanks, Mehran. Thanks, Mehran, for an amazing introduction. There's so many people I want to thank. I'm just going to give a general thanks to everybody here at Georgetown University, Qatar, at the campus here for an amazing time. Lori and I are here not just for me to have this opportunity to speak, but also to see the country a little bit and to run around as much as we can in about a week. And it's been really an interesting experience. The other two times that I've been here, I didn't have this opportunity and to visit the campus, but also to visit the city and the wider country in a short amount of time. And it's been very, very interesting, I have to say, to spend time here and to see the impressive work that's going on at the campus. I just want to say, in terms of my own work on Iran, I was not trained as a so-called Iran expert. Mark Twain once said an expert is somebody from out of town. And I very much often feel that that's the case with me. I was at the University of Chicago oh so long ago, and one of my former advisors, Marvin Zonis, was working on a book on the fall of the Shah, right? And he said, do you want to do some research? And I said, yeah, why not? And then I suddenly discovered this place called Iran. And I came across a trove of work that was basically initially translations of Khomeini's speeches. And the more I delved into this, the more I was fascinated by this place. And honestly, at the time, I found it more, I was working on a dissertation on Egypt, but I found Iran much more interesting and compelling, and it continues to be a place that really fascinates me. So I am, in some sense, so in the old days, they called us Arabists, right? But I have made a kind of transition over time to working on both Iran and the Arab world, and I continue to do so to this very day. And I also produce 1 or 2 articles per month for the Arab Center, some of which are republished in A Responsible Statecraft, These articles are based on current events, but I always try to give them a kind of deeper analytical, conceptual perspective. And it's in that context that I have been writing about Iran for the Center for a good, 2.5, 3 years. And obviously in the context of the Gaza war and everything else, I've been trying to figure out how Iran has responded to the Al-Aqsa flood attacks, the ensuing war, Israel's military incursion into Gaza, and all the things that have occurred, and particularly the growing escalation in the region with a higher potential of a potential clash between the United States and Iran, although for reasons that I'll talk about, I don't think this is going to happen. But it is a very dangerous moment indeed. And I'm not going to get into too many details. I want to sketch out a kind of perspective for you as the basis for a kind of thesis. I'll give you a few examples of what I'm getting at, and then have an opportunity for my colleague to comment on my perspective, and also open up the discussion to the audience, because I think that's primarily, the value added is to have a discussion and have a kind of interaction of ideas. So that's going to be my approach. And let me say from the beginning that my basic perspective is very different from perhaps the one you hear in some policy circles in Washington and elsewhere, which sees Iran as a major sort of player and impetus for Hamas's attack across the border and the ensuing battle that took place. My thesis, my argument is that Iran was quite surprised by what happened, but more importantly, that Iran's whole resistance strategy, while not disrupted by the Gaza events and the war that has ensued, and by Hamas's attack and everything else, including Israel's expanding operations in Gaza, that Iran's perspective in terms of its approach to resistance, so-called, and I'll get into that in a moment, has been challenged and somewhat perhaps even undermined by the events in Gaza in ways that continue to pose real challenges for the regime, for the supreme leader, for his allies, whose fundamental interest at the end of the day is regime survival. And everything that we talk about in terms of the so-called resistance, and not merely the narrative, because some of what I will talk about is the narrative, but I'm really interested in the politics and the alliance building around resistance. And that alliance building takes place at home, it takes place in the region, and it takes place on a more global level. In fact, I think we have to recognize that the so-called axis of resistance and the approach and the narrative of resistance is constantly changing and constantly integrating new elements. It's not what it was 2 or 3 years ago or 4 years ago. It has a much wider global perspective than it initially did. But that doctrine of resistance, that strategy of resistance, is fundamental to really supporting the regime's survival and setting the place for what could eventually be and will eventually be the succession of the supreme leader in probably the next year or two, although some of these characters learn to survive a lot longer and keep speculating on who will succeed Ali Khamenei, and we've been speculating for a long time, haven't we? But in any case, I want to say that the axis of resistance is essentially a balancing act. It's essentially a strategy to reach a sweet spot, if you like, between multiple agendas and multiple goals, whose ultimate goal, of course, is regime survival, but which is also a balancing act between multiple players. Who are the players? First of all, they're the players in and around the regime itself. We have seen the ascendancy of ultra-hardliners, principalists, they go by different names, specifically in the last couple of years, and the increasing exclusion of what used to be called the reformers from the political arena. But nevertheless, within the so-called hardline camp, there are multiple powers, multiple groups, multiple factions, and in many respects, it's the job of the supreme leader to arbitrate among them. And he's often, in some sense, the adult in the room, warning not to go too far. And what he means by not to go too far is not to push the axis of resistance towards a military conflict with Israel or the United States. He wants to have what I call a no war, no victory, but no war approach, which means really using the allies of Iran as a kind of forward representative of Iranian interests, but also in ways that play into their own interests. I don't like the word proxy. It doesn't seem to get at and capture the relationship with Iran's allies in the region, in Iraq, in Lebanon, in Yemen. I was trying to come up with a cute word for it. How do you sort of talk about a proxy who's also an ally? And I haven't come up with one yet, but I think it's important to recognize that part of the resistance strategy is a relationship between balancing not only forces within the regime itself, but also establishing relationships with allies in the region that assures that Iran can defend the regime, assure that Iran can defend its military and economic interests, but in ways that are meant to prevent a slide into full-scale war with the United States or Israel. That's the sweet spot. It doesn't mean that the relationship between, for example, Iran and Hezbollah is it meant not to make life difficult for Israel, for example. It certainly is. But what you want from that relationship, particularly Hezbollah, is Hezbollah's capacity to prevent an Israeli attack on Iran's nuclear facilities, and therefore to serve as a deterrent, but not for Hezbollah to pursue a full-scale war with Israel. And that's the same thing that Iran wants with its relationships with other players in the region, including Iraq and in Yemen, and of course Hamas. And here my basic thesis is that Hamas's attack in ways that Iran was not prepared for, nor was its allies, particularly Lebanon, prepared for, has really in many respects upended or certainly complicated the axis of resistance, because it's created a context in which regional players who are allied with Iran may be willing and have an interest in pursuing conflict either with the United States or with Israel in ways that go far beyond what Iran really wants. So the question is, how do you have your cake and eat it too? How do you get the deterrent effect of these forces without paying the cost of having them go in directions that ultimately could provoke an escalation that you do not want? And so that's Iran's predicament, and the predicament was greatly sharpened by the Al-Aqsa flood, so-called, B, Israel's incursion and military campaign, and it's created a dynamic of escalation that Iran's leaders are now trying to contain and control, even though they speak in the language of resistance and opposition to the United States. Their goal is to find a way to ultimately stand back from a full-scale confrontation. And I do believe, and I'll be happy to discuss this with you further, and I've said in my most recent piece for the Arab Center that only if there's a ceasefire in Gaza can we hope for the escalation that's occurring to stop and go back in the opposite direction. Without a ceasefire, I'm very worried about the ultimate context. Iran needs a ceasefire as well. The Iranian leadership needs a ceasefire as well, but everything will hinge, I say, in a somewhat humorous vein towards the end of my last piece, that in many respects, the Iranian regime is hoping that President Biden gets them out of a kind of quandary that they find themselves in by pushing Israel towards accepting the conditions for a ceasefire, but we'll see if that happens. So this notion of this sweet spot, this notion of this, this balancing act, it takes place, and the narrative differs over time, but I'll throw out some words that the leader and elements of the regime use. They use the term strategic patience. They use the term, and this is very much one that Khomeini brought up in 2013 to legitimate the negotiations over the nuclear file, heroic flexibility. That's another term for it. These terms denote an idea of having no war and no peace, but also being pragmatic and being able to defend your interests in ways that really demonstrate your prowess, your ability to hit back, your ability to deter your enemies, but also restrain your own forces and those allied with you from going too far and opening up a can of worms that you can't eventually put back in the can at all. So Khomeini has said recently, and I like this expression, he's done this many times, he says, of course, a few years ago when I mentioned the term heroic flexibility, that's 2013 first, it was misunderstood both inside and outside the country. Because expediency means finding a way to overcome difficult obstacles and to continue the path until you reach your goal. Today, the cooperation and alignment of some big and important countries of the world with Iran is an unprecedented phenomenon, and we should appreciate this opportunity and strengthen relations with these countries. So we have the circle of the regime where the balancing act is played. We have the circle of Iran's regional allies, and now the whole notion of the narrative of resistance has been enlarged to include, of course, other countries, including Russia and China. And in this regard, China's role in helping to birth a resumption of relations between Iran and Saudi Arabia is fundamental to sort of that diplomatic process. So resistance also means diplomacy. Resistance also means bringing to the camp new allies. And it means readjusting your strategy. And of course, here, the key issue to keep in mind is the bigger the concentric circles, the wider the field of participation, the more constraints Iran faces as well. China and Russia have their own interests. They're not the same. The Iranians are very aware of that. They talk about it all the time. And so once again, it's a balancing act. Now, why has this balancing act become particularly important over the last couple of years? And I would say the main reason for this is that increasingly what we've seen over the last 2 years is an effort by the hardliners in the regime really to institutionalize their power in a deeper, more embedded way, to exclude any so-called reformists from the arena and even more pragmatic voices, and to place themselves in a position where they will be able to influence the succession to come over Ali Khamenei in the next year or so. And that means really taking over a whole series of institutions. I won't bore you with the names, but a whole series of military and political institutions to set the stage for what will be a rebirth of the regime from the perspective of Ali Khamenei in the next couple of years. And that is fundamental to the regime. And in this regard, there's been something of a change of the guard. In Iran, you may know that Ali Shamkhani, who was the head chair of the Supreme National Council, and who really, Shamkhani really pioneered the regional relationships that Iran over the last 2 years has established with different players and helped to give birth to Iran's establishing diplomatic relations or reestablishing with Saudi Arabia. Ali Shamkhani in May was replaced by Ali Akbar Ahmadian. And Ahmadian is really, well, first of all, Shamkhani is an Arab Iranian. He has that particular pedigree, and that played a role in facilitating his role in the region in terms of creating a kind of detente and creating a kind of a reassertion of Iranian relationships with Arab states in the region. Saudi Arabia is only one of them. And he really succeeded in that regard quite considerably. And the crown of that process of which is, again, part of the resistance strategy, was the establishment of relations or reestablishment of relations with Saudi Arabia. But when you have a supreme leader in charge and you have somebody so successful as Shamkhani was in pursuing this regional detente strategy, at some point or other, you've got to get rid of him. And I don't mean physically, by the way, but put him somewhere else in the political arena, because he's going to be making trouble for you. And Shamkhani's had presidential aspirations in the past. So he was replaced in May by Ali Akbar Ahmadian. And Ali Akbar Ahmadian is known as a kind of Khomeini purist. And he's also known as one of the most dedicated ideologues and hardliners who really wants to move from a policy of what's called by the Supreme Leader himself, strategic restraint. Again, that's part of this sort of whole package of balancing acts that are so fundamental to the resistance strategy. Ahmadiyyan wants, and his allies want, for Iran to really move beyond deterrence and take a much more aggressive approach towards the United States, towards Israel, and really hit Iran's allies, enemies much harder. And I think his emergence in the regime over the last year and his effort to consolidate with other allies the power of the ultra-hardliners really presents a challenge because, of course, it's not only a challenge in terms of Iran's policies in the region, it's also a challenge for Khomeini himself because he constantly has to tell these hardliners, stand back. Let's not overdo it. Let's not push it too hard. The doctrine of strategic patience, which I advocate, is still the doctrine of resistance, and therefore this notion that we're going to abandon this policy for a much more aggressive approach militarily is one that I don't necessarily support. So what we've seen in the context of this relationship is, on the one hand, and this is in the year, at least in the year leading up to the Gaza conflict, we've seen the consolidation of these hardliners, and that consolidation, as I've written about, has unfolded in tandem with an effort of Iran to pull back from regional conflicts and to establish its focus on stabilizing the Iranian political arena, which means, of course, among other things, repressing the protest movement that had emerged more over the last year, and creating a context in which, by creating regional relationships, one can establish and institutionalize the legacy of the Supreme Leader. And that all of that meant that Iran had to avoid getting dragged into regional and global conflicts it couldn't handle at a critical moment where it's trying to make sure that it's reconsolidating its power and setting the stage for a transition. And Ahmadiyyan and his allies were devoting themselves to this strategy. And part of it, by the way, we sometimes forget this, was a readiness of Iran to perhaps come to some sort of interim agreement with the United States on the fate of the nuclear agreement, the JCPOA, some sort of temporary arrangement that would calm the waters, not solve it, but at least postpone negotiations to a future date. So there was this elaborate diplomacy of trying to avoid regional conflicts, and an elaborate diplomacy at home of trying to set the stage for this succession. And that's why in my most recent piece I said this is a terrible time for Iran to face the Gaza conflict, because it's the last thing they were looking for was an escalation that would really shake the strategy of resistance, and the sweet spot has become the sour spot. I just came up with that line this morning. But I thought, yes, there it is. It's no longer the sweet spot because it's really hard given what's going on. And what is going on? I think part of what's going on is increasingly the hardliners feel that Iran has lost its deterrent power. And they're calling for a more aggressive perspective because they feel that Iran doesn't have deterrence. But also, I think the hardliners have to deal with regional allies who have their own agendas. It is often said in the Washington policy arena, whether we're talking about Hamas or whether we're talking about Hezbollah or the allies of Iran in Iraq, or of course the Houthis in Yemen, that they are mere proxies of the Iranian regime. No, they are not. They have their own interests. They have their own concerns. They have to balance those interests with their relationship with Iran. There, too, is a balancing act. But I think what we have seen in the context of the escalation in Gaza and Israel's military incursion and the thousands of civilians who have died as a result of that is a commitment from many of Iran's allies to pursuing a much more aggressive stance in ways that present real challenges for Iran. Here we've seen attacks, particularly from Iran's allies in Iraq, but the Houthis in particular. I noted in one of the last papers I wrote that the Houthis are a kind of special group. They're not tethered really to any kind of state. They're not constrained by the kind of balancing act that Hezbollah has to concern itself with. Hezbollah is part of the Lebanese government. The Iraqi militias that are supported by Iran are in effect affiliated with the government. The Houthis are a different species almost altogether, and they feel much less concerned about those sorts of local or domestic constraints and much more emboldened to pursue their conflicts. So suddenly Iran is finding itself pushed by its own hardliners inside the country, but also towed or pulled by other actors in the region, particularly the Houthis, but also their allies in Iraq, to pursue a much more aggressive stance. And what we've seen, particularly in the Red Sea, is an example of what's going on in that regard. And the question for Iran is sort of how to sort of avoid letting this escalate while at the same time demonstrating that they are continuing to be supporters of Hamas and have not abandoned the Palestinians. That's the real balancing act for Iran right now. And we've seen in that sense a kind of interesting, talk about narratives of resistance, we've seen a kind of change in Iran's language. In November, you will recall, there was a brief ceasefire. I'm not sure how long it lasted, maybe a week. Didn't last very long. Of course, many people, they didn't call it a ceasefire. Neither side wanted to call it a ceasefire. But it seemed to open up the chances for diplomacy, and Iran's foreign minister made a statement numerous times that what Iran wanted was a permanent ceasefire. What Iran wanted was an end to the Israeli attack. What Iran wanted was diplomacy of some kind. But increasingly, Iran's rhetoric has become much more radical in basically saying, you know what, this has to end with some sort of diplomatic solution that doesn't include the existence of a Jewish state. And they've been quite explicit about this. So, Iranian leaders on the narrative side feel much more sort of emboldened to make that claim. At the same time, they don't want that kind of assertion to lead them down the road of war. And that is sort of the predicament that I think Iran finds itself now in. If you consider the recent attacks by Iran across the border in Erbil and also in Pakistan, and that sort of seemed to come out of the blue, right? What was going on with that? Turns out there's an interesting story that helps to explain it. But my sense was that Iran was sort of lashing out. What are we going to do? We have to demonstrate our prowess. We have to demonstrate the reach of our missiles. We have to show we're playing the game, but we have to do so in ways that don't get us in trouble. And at the same time, after the United States escalated its confrontation with Iran's allies in Iraq and, of course, the Houthis, we see at the same time that Iran is still saying to this very day that they don't want a war with the United States. So the question ultimately is how Iran is going to get itself out of this particular bind that it finds itself. And it's a bind that is very much indicative of a resistance strategy that increasingly requires Iran to balance its military goals with its political and diplomatic goals of establishing and sustaining these relations, not only with regional players, but of course China and Russia, and how to do that under these circumstances. Ultimately, I think, and I'm going to end here, I have lots more details to talk about that, but I really didn't want to get into them. Ultimately, I think, as I said at the outset, the only way that Iran is going to be able to get out of this mess and pull back and get its allies to pull back, and that's critical, is for some meaningful end of the war in Gaza, some sort of ceasefire that lasts more than a week or two, an end to the violence, and some sort of diplomatic process that Iran ultimately may not support, but it wouldn't necessarily oppose, right? Because I think that without that, Iran will find that many of its regional allies, particularly the Houthis, are not the least bit interested in terms of in de-escalation, and are not at all intimidated by the American show of force, which is ongoing as we speak, probably in the Red Sea and in the Gulf. I think that Iran will find itself in quite a position. So strangely enough, and I'll end here, Iran is waiting for President Biden to get them out of hot water. And I'm not sure if Biden can pull it off, but if we don't see some ceasefire that becomes a diplomatic process, my concern is the escalation that both the Americans, the Israelis, and the Iranians fear will actually get worse. I'll leave it on that happy note and happy to answer any of your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, Dan.
Yeah.
That was terrific. Tour de force discussion, and as always, insightful. And so I'll just open the discussion
Yeah.
by asking you to, if you would, elaborate. Just recently, I think it was 2 days ago, when we saw a report in the New York Times saying that U.S. intelligence believe Iran doesn't have full control over its
Yeah, I read that,
proxies,
right.
and is Iran losing control? And then there was another piece by an Iranian based in Tehran, an Iranian scholar for the Stimson Center, saying same thing basically, that is Iran losing control over its allies. You painted a much more nuanced picture, saying these guys have their own, Iran's allies, have their own interests. And what Tehran needs to do is to balance out this kind of so-called axis of resistance. In some ways, I can't help but to think Iran got itself into this mess with this kind of its rhetoric and the fact that even more balanced and nuanced reporting by Al Jazeera cannot announce or pronounce the word Houthi without saying Iran-backed Houthis. Whereas, as you mentioned, the Houthis, for example, are much more of independent agents than proxies of Iran. So, and yeah, I know it's up to Biden to probably get Iran out of this mess, but can you elaborate on this kind of Iran's effort to pull the strings with this axis of resistance post-Qasem Soleimani?
Yes, and Qasem Soleimani's assassination, of course, really was a pivotal moment because the hardliners say we had to demonstrate deterrence. And what they've been saying the last 6 months is we failed. Look, we don't have deterrence. We were promised that and we never got it. So that's a major, I'm glad you mentioned that, because that's a major sort of vector in this story, isn't it? You know, if there's anybody in this room who understands the Houthis, please let me know, because they're a tough sort of group to understand. But what I said before about the Houthis not being tethered to a kind of state and raison d'etat is very much, I think, part of the problem. They're a revolutionary force inspired by a kind of xenophobic and distinctly anti-Semitic sort of ideology. I mean, apart from their opposition to Zionism is their intense hatred, which is very manifest in their rhetoric, of Jews. And about 7, 8 years ago, they sent a group to, or maybe a decade ago, they sent a group at the Atlantic Council and to speak to folks, and they had to say, you know, some of this rhetoric just is not going to wash here in Washington and beyond. And they just somehow didn't get it. They're so enamored of this rhetoric. And so I think that they really are sort of in love with their own, a theory of resistance that goes far beyond what the supreme leader, who, as I said before, the supreme leader is, you know, he's not a hothead. I mean, his interest is regime survival. And so the balancing act that he's concerned about doesn't concern the Houthis. And I do think they're pushing an agenda. Now, does that mean that the Houthis don't get, I mean, we know the Houthis are supported by Iran. We know that Houthi technology and the rest of it comes from Iran, as we know with Hezbollah and Hamas. But there's distinctly a kind of rationale and logic to Houthi actions, which really seem to only embolden them when they're hit. So it's a legitimate question to ask how a notion of deterrence works with the Houthis. I think it clearly works with Hezbollah. I think it clearly works with the militias in Iraq, who in fact stated recently, we don't want a conflict. We're pulling back. We've hit you hard in Jordan, where we lost 3 soldiers and so on, but we don't want this conflict. Those are also close relationships with Iran. And the Houthis are something else. Of course, for Hezbollah, the real concern for Hezbollah is that if their war escalates with Israel, this could be catastrophic for both countries. A mutually assured catastrophe, I call it, in some sense, because Hezbollah's missiles can reach as far as Tel Aviv and beyond, and they would certainly launch them massively if Israel invaded Lebanon and along the lines that it had in the past. So what Hezbollah is doing is shooting missiles across the border that go 7, 8, 10 miles, but not beyond that. And it doesn't mean people aren't getting hurt and the Israelis aren't perturbed by it, but both sides still have a sense of the limits. It seems to be the case in the Iraqi-US theater as well. Even as we hit hard, the calculation of the Americans is that we're demonstrating deterrence, but it doesn't work with the Houthis in the same way, and that's my concern. So let's say tomorrow there is, inshallah, some sort of, I mean, not a week or two, but some sort of real halt to the violence and some sort of ceasefire. Not guaranteed that the Houthis would stop, but I would guess that Iran would press them and use its levers to get them to stand back if that would be the case. Because Iran wants, at this point, I mean, the death and the destruction, the killing, I mean, it's horrendous. But Hamas has survived. It really has survived. And at this point, if the fighting stops, it's a victory for Hamas, isn't it? So Iran, of course, wants the fighting to stop because it understands that this would be not only a symbolic victory, but a political, in some sense, a military victory for Hamas as well.
Just one more question before we open it up. So you're not of the opinion that is out there in cyberspace and elsewhere that once Israel is done with Gaza, then it's going to go after Hezbollah in southern Lebanon and kind of take care of that problem. And before that might actually even go through the West Bank to get there.
The scariest thing about the current government in Israel is that it's really not coherent. It's really divided. And these are not just tactical divisions, they're strategic divisions. And so there are clearly voices on the extreme right that have been advocating for, of course, expelling Palestinians from Gaza, but also going to Lebanon. And the fear, of course, is that once you get a ceasefire, you transfer those troops and you put them into the Lebanon theater, as they say. And that cannot be excluded, but the cost of a full-scale war between Hezbollah and Israel is so high for both parties that I think there would be a major effort, and I think that's part of what Blinken is doing right now, to really get everybody to stand back. And there was a piece just the other day about the future of Bibi Netanyahu. You should never discount him, right? But the events of the Al-Aqsa attacks, the atrocities, everything else, the failure of Israel to prevent it, to deter it, have really put him in a very serious bind. And so another thing that could happen is if there's a ceasefire, it would open up the space for a political reckoning in Israel. So I cannot, and of course the situation in the West Bank is very, very grim because the settlers have been given a free hand, right? But I don't think that what we're going to see is a full-scale war. In fact, my guess would be that Hezbollah would stand back if there was a ceasefire. And of course, if you look at what they did after the initial halting of military activity back in November, they suddenly stopped firing missiles, just like that. So Houthis wouldn't necessarily be in the same frame of mind, but that arena would be certainly one that could get worse. But I think the Lebanon situation would go back to some sort of quasi-stability. As far as the West Bank is concerned, the United States has suddenly discovered that it would have been a good idea to push for a Palestinian state 20 years ago. And suddenly we're talking about it now under conditions that, of course, the settlers know would almost preclude the creation of such a state. So it's a very desperate situation, and there is an air of desperation in the U.S. effort now to promote an idea. My own take, and I've spent, as you probably know, I spent most of my career avoiding the Arab-Israeli conflict. It's such a emotionally difficult conflict to sort of contend with. I have friends and family on both sides of the sort of struggle, as it were. But my own position, though, has always been that the problem with the peace process was it never defined from the beginning an end state. Nobody said we're trying to get this or that. The word Palestinian state was not part of the Oslo Accord. And that was an absolute disaster because a negotiating process succeeds when you know where you want to get and then you haggle over the price. Am I buying this carpet? Am I doing this? Am I doing that? Was the Israeli-Egyptian process. And then they haggled. But here, there was no definition of a state as being the end game. And so every spoiler that was around had an opportunity to intervene. It was a very bad formula. And a lot of the people who participated at Oslo have been writing the Times and so on, expressing that point of view. We made a mistake, we should have defined it. And now we're defining that goal under conditions which seem nearly impossible.
Perfect, okay, thank you. We have time for some questions. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you very much for your comments regarding this.
Sorry, there's a mic that's coming your way.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I can talk louder.
Well, yeah,
They're
but for
recording,
recording
so-
purposes, it would be, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your comments and input about the this very delicate issue. I'm curious, you mentioned several things about the United States, and with the upcoming presidential elections, even though you mentioned Biden as the current president and Iran's dependence on him to try to help them de-escalate a bit or push back on the rhetoric, how do you see the outcome of the election impacting what might happen in this area?
Well, I mean, clearly one of the explanations for Biden's behavior is the political horizon that's coming up. I think, both tactically and strategically, his embrace of Netanyahu was a mistake. And a lot of folks would probably agree with that assessment. That he was coming from, not from the head, but from the heart, as if we were living in a somewhat different decade or something like that. I understand it, but a few weeks later, the administration realized, well, look what we've done. We've given the green light to something that ultimately we now have to stop, right? And we're not stopping it. And Bibi says, I'm going to go on and on. So it's a very difficult situation for Biden, because now he really if he's serious about pushing, he really has to be ready to do so under conditions with an upcoming election. And it depresses me to think about the American political arena for all kinds of reasons that we all know, right? Where the possibility of a Trump victory cannot be discounted. But I would say, in answer to your question a somewhat different way, when Biden came into office, most of the policies he adopted was essentially Trump light when it came to the Middle East. Both on the nuclear question, the fate of the JCPOA, the Palestine question, everything was somehow, and particularly the Abraham Accords, right? The Abraham Accords, I joke with my colleagues, I say, it's great to go to Dubai to have a bar mitzvah. I mean, let's do that. That's so wonderful. Let's, religious reconciliation, all the rhetoric. But the whole process was built to avoid the Palestinian question. It was orchestrated to avoid the Palestinian issue. And that was ultimately catastrophic. And now suddenly Saudi Arabia, it's interesting that MBS, he was very careful not to push in the last 6 months for a Palestinian state. He avoided the term, and he wanted to be very accommodating. And suddenly, of course, this is the big question. US, Saudi Arabia, initiative, normalization with Israel. But before that, the entire policy of the Biden administration seemed to be an extension of Trump's policies. And while I understand, to be perfectly frank with you, how unhappy and disillusioned young Arab Americans are with Biden, and particularly Palestinian Americans, and I understand why they're threatening to vote against him. The consequences of having Trump back in office will be even worse, right? And so that's what disconcerts me. I understand the disillusionment. I understand the anger. I read the piece the other day. A friend of mine, Khalid al-Gindi, who was, many of the people in the Palestinian camp who used to be advocates of peace, it's true on both sides of the equation, by the way, are now disillusioned and angry and furious. And Gindi noted that there was a Palestinian American who was supposed to have a meeting with Biden, and he refused to go. He said, 90 of my family members have died in Gaza. I'm not going to meet with Biden. And I get that. But the consequence of an election that puts Trump back in office will be that any effort to build some sort of diplomacy on the rubble of this conflict and the violence will end or go nowhere. And Trump's basic approach is to do the opposite of what the previous president did. Everything that Trump did was to, in some sense, defy what Obama tried to put in place, including the agreement with Iran. And by the way, we haven't talked about it, but Iran's nuclear program is going full speed ahead. Enrichment is going on. And there's no agreement to stop it. There was this temporary moment, as I mentioned before, when Iran was working on regional issues and trying to find space to consolidate power at home, where it was signaling that it might come up with a temporary agreement. That fell apart. There's the Rob Malley story and all that. All those things came together, and nobody's talking about that anymore. And that's a serious issue, too, that could sustain or reignite conflict between the United States and Iran as well.
Thank you. Just on Trump, just to play the devil's advocate, not that I necessarily support him, but did he not show, apart from the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, a reluctance to use force?
He did. And Trump is at heart a businessman.
Right.
And war is not good for business. And of course, his relationships, and that of his son-in-law, business relationships with the royal family in Saudi Arabia was really what it was all about for him. That's my interpretation. And a lot of the, if you look at the anatomy of the Accords, the Abraham Accords, a lot of it was pushed by people who were involved who were establishing those business relationships and who saw it as an opportunity. So you're right. I mean, essentially when we faced the possibility of escalation in Syria, for example, in Iraq, Trump basically said, we're not going there. He's not a warmonger by any stretch of the imagination. I think he's more at heart an isolationist, certainly than an interventionist. Of course, right now he's blaming Biden for not being hard enough, not being tough enough.
Right.
Well, there's the real shocker right there, right? But I think that Trump would essentially try to sort of, as much as he can, have a rhetoric of defiance with Iran, but avoid at all costs any kind of conflict there as well. I mean, that's what I anticipate. I'd like to just think that your question is based on a scenario that we won't see, that is Trump's victory. But we can't exclude it.
Right.
Can we?
Right. Yeah. Beverly?
Thank you very much. I'm just wondering if we could maybe, or if you might elaborate a little bit more on the axis of resistance narrative and strategic patience. On the one hand, I totally understand and I get where you're coming from in terms of some of the allies that you spoke of, in particular, for example, Hezbollah. But in some senses, it could be argued that with Hamas, that's exactly what Hamas did, and that also with the support, so Hamas got very, very good at practicing strategic patience and playing the game, and also used that time and those opportunities to create or to address the asymmetric balance of power or deterrence with Israel. And in some respects, it's been convincingly evidenced and argued even by the Qassam Brigade's own communiques, videos and clips, that in terms of, for example, drone technology, there were important developments. So I'm just wondering if I could sort of slightly try and flip the coin a little bit. I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm just trying to sort of unpick it a little bit. And secondly, if I may, I would like to push back on your assertion about the Oslo process. I think that some people would see it quite differently. They would argue that there was always a very clear end state, if you'll excuse the pun, and that was Palestinian statehood. Certainly in terms of track 2 negotiations up to Camp David, that was always the game in town. It was understood by both sides and those that were mediating to support both sides. And that the real reason why the mistake of not supporting statehood lies elsewhere. Thank you so much.
Well, we can't run history backwards, but on your first question, I do think that, first of all, let's be very clear that Hamas's attack was made possible by the kind of support they got from Iran, right? The technology, the intelligence. But it turns out in retrospect that Hamas was practicing so-called strategic patience with the whole plan to basically pretend that it was happy with the status quo in preparation for this attack. Now, experts on Palestinian affairs and Hamas that I know, Palestinian Israelis still not quite sure what they were trying to achieve, particularly given the atrocities that were committed, right? But what is remarkable about this story was how well Hamas played everybody and was able to essentially feign this sort of it's not coexistence, what would you call it? This avoidance of war with Israel and acceptance of the status quo while preparing extensively for a much more decisive attack on Israel. That's very different from the Iranian practice of resistance. And I get it from the Hamas perspective, of course, because they felt that nobody was listening to them, that the world had forgotten their cause. There was about to be the possibility of normalization of relations between Israel and Saudi Arabia, and they were going to do something about this. They lost, let me put it this way, they lost their patience. They pretended to have patience, and then they lost it, because they had a different strategy in mind. And as I've said, their strategy really put the Iranians in a difficult position because it ended up lighting the fire that they weren't prepared for. We could have, I suppose, a polite disagreement on this question. I was struck by two things in the last 4 months. First of all, a lot of folks in the American political arena, including Ambassador Daniel Kurtzer and others who were part of this process, have been talking quite publicly and writing quite publicly about what a mistake it was not to define the end goal quite clearly and not leave it as implicit, but define it explicitly. David Aaron Miller is another one. A lot of people who were involved in the process have come to that conclusion. I think it's a correct one, because I think by not defining it, you open the door to spoilers. And within, of course, a week or two of the first Oslo Accords being signed, the late Prime Minister Rabin went up before the Knesset and said, there will never be a Palestinian state. This process is about creating some sort of entity, and I can assure you that there will not be a Palestinian state. And of course, 3 weeks later, he was assassinated for all he had tried to say, right? And his effort to calm the right wing, obviously, from the extreme right, didn't succeed, right? He paid for this diplomacy with his life. But he was very clear about excluding the possibility of a Palestinian state. And then, of course, if you look at settlement building that occurred within the context and after Oslo, it just went up and up and up and up and up. The strategy of using settlements to preclude a Palestinian state was very clear. And so the advocates of settlements used the Oslo process to expand Israeli settlement building on the West Bank. And so apart from not defining the goal of a Palestinian state, the process of settlement building, if you look at the map now, how is this going to happen? This is exactly what the settlers want. They wanted a process that would make it impossible to establish a viable Palestinian state. And I think in many respects they may have succeeded.
Thank you. Gerd?
Thanks very much. Going back to the nuclear question, you say they're going full speed ahead. I've always been, puzzled by that, or by even trying to figure out what is actually going on, what has been going on, because we've had clear statements repeatedly by Khomeini and then subsequently reaffirmed that the use of nuclear weapons is completely beyond the pale in terms of Islamic ethics and law. So that seems very clear, and we're saying that also to an Iranian public in Persian. So that's the first base of my uncertainty. How does one explain that? But second one is precisely what you said. The one thing, if they wanted to play this kind of balancing game, the one thing surely they wouldn't do is to go full blast for nuclear weapons. So how do we square that circle?
Well, I think you summarized the Iranian perspective on this, Gerd, very well, which is how can you have your cake and eat it too, right? In terms of creating an enrichment program that's robust enough to indicate the possibility of having a weapon, and knowing very well that the drive for a weapon, there's all this talk. I plunged into this issue for several years, and I'm not as is involved in it anymore, but there's always talk about the Iranians creating a bomb. Once you create a bomb, you're in serious trouble. As an expert I know who very well knows a lot more about this than I do, put it prosaically, you have to create a family of bombs. That's what deterrence is all about. And so it would be treacherous and perilous for Iran to go beyond a certain level of, let's say, 60 or 70% enrichment to creating a bomb, to testing, of course, because that would provoke an Israeli attack for sure, and or an American attack. So I think that's what they're looking for. I think the single most disastrous foreign policy decision in the last 10 years was Trump's decision to pull out of the JCPOA. We're living with the consequences of that now. I think the Iranians would be happy with an agreement that would limit their enrichment within certain parameters, allow for inspections, and the hardliners would be happy to live with that kind of arrangement, but that was excluded, wasn't it? So, and the irony here is this, and this is something that Obama understood very well from the beginning. You either have an agreement or you have a war. And what I mean by that is, either you get, if you don't have an agreement, Iran can go full speed with some sort of enrichment program. Perhaps not weaponization, perhaps not testing, but more enrichment, right? And then hiding more of that if you possibly can. If you don't get an agreement, the only way to stop them is an American military attack. And the U.S. doesn't want to do this. The U.S. political and military, especially military leaders, don't believe that they would succeed. They predict the opposite would happen. And so without an agreement, Iran is incentivized to simply enrich more. And so no agreement increases their political leverage in the next negotiation. And that's the catch-22 that Obama understood. If we don't get an agreement, because without an agreement, enrichment, Javad Zarif kept saying, look at us, we're just enriching more and more. We're going on and on and on. By the way, you notice that the regime is now reaching out to the former Foreign Minister Zarif to get his assistance. Sometimes getting back a few reformists in the game, or neo-reformists, is useful. But Zarif said, by not negotiating, you're putting yourselves in a position where we have more leverage in any future negotiations. That's where we are now.
And if I may just add, what you just said is said not just by Zarif, but a lot of Iranian diplomats in Tehran are saying that. You don't want an agreement? Fine. We're going to push with enrichment and make it more difficult for you, or increase our leverage.
The problem with that line initially was that, we'll enrich more in order to create more leverage. And then the enrichment has a kind of life of its own, right? And so under Rouhani was a window to reach some sort of agreement to rejoin the JCPOA, because we left it. I mean, we walked away, right? And I think resistance on the Hill in Congress, I think resistance from Israel, I think there was a lot of diplomatic and military resistance to the U.S. going back to some sort of agreement. And by the time the administration realized what it needed to do, we had a new president in Iran and a new ball game. Because to go back to what I was saying before, what is happening now is, and I sort of wrote about this in my book, I mean, the Iranian political system was built around containing and negotiating and modulating multiple arenas of power and players who had different views of the ultimate purpose of an Islamic republic. Right? And the reformists under Khatami espoused a radically different sort of approach to the world than the hardliners. This wasn't a tactical difference, this was a strategic difference. And what the hardliners are trying to do their best now is to bury the legacy of what I used to call the Islamic left, who then became like the Islamic liberals, but they didn't like the word liberal, so they avoided it, who were for engagement, were for agreements, even on the Palestine issue. And to sort of permanently bury this wing of the Islamic revolutionary family, and to impose their will, and at the same time not have consequences which are unacceptable for Iran in imposing their will on Iranian internal policy and external policy. That's where we're at.
Thank you. John?
Thank you. Thank you. A few years ago, when Daesh was active in Syria and Iraq, Iran got engaged in fighting ISIS in both places, and they justified their intervention in both countries to their own public opinion, saying that they had to fight there because otherwise they would fight in the Iranian borders or in the Iranian territory. This gave Soleimani and the IRGC a lot of support. Now, with this new situation, Iranian interests have been attacked in Lebanon, Iraq, and Syria, and Iran keeps saying, we reserve the right to respond, we reserve the right to respond. To what extent they can keep this narrative of resistance, saying we are going to respond when we decide, but the Iranian public opinion start to consider, okay, they are not defending us.
Right.
I mean, there was an attack.
The Khomeini attacks, the 2 bombings, which resulted in 95 deaths, on the anniversary of the martyrdom, if you like, of Soleimani, right? And it was timed, clearly it was timed for that purpose, to get a message across. This is part of what the hardliners are saying, that we've promised that we went to war with these groups. We said we defeated them, and yet they're still active, right? In Iran and from across the border as well. Of course, the Iranian perception, the perception of the regime is that ISIS is somehow, in some respect, a product of the U.S. political maneuvering and so on. That conspiracy theory is still there. But the Iranians went to war with ISIS for very good reasons and took a lot of the leadership in trying to defeat that movement in Syria and Iraq. And it's not defeated. And to have that kind of bombing on January 2nd or 3rd, there were 2 bombings that left at least 100 people who were attacked in the streets, essentially, dead. That reverberates throughout Iran because the thing that the Iranian regime promises it can produce is domestic security. And with elections coming up in March for the Majlis and for the elections for the Council of Experts, which technically is the body, as you know, that picks the next supreme leader coming up, this is a very bad time to have that sort of attack. So this is, again, putting the regime on the spot. There's no doubt about it. But one has to say that it doesn't take much to pull off that kind of attack, right? As horrendous as it is, it doesn't take a lot of technology. Iranians have a very, on the domestic level, and not everywhere in the country is, but certainly in certain areas, including Iranian Baluchistan, have very serious security challenges. And they don't have an easy solution for that. So the gap between the rhetoric and of resistance and the reality can be pretty wide when that sort of attack takes place.
Thank you. Dan, we can let you go by asking you for some predictions. So by way of conclusion, you already predicted that Khamenei is going to be gone within a year or 2, and we're going to hold you to that. He's 84.
Did I
now?
say 3 years? Okay.
He's 84, I think, right now.
He eats a lot of yogurt. He takes long walks. He's been fighting off all kinds of health problems, but he could be around. Who knows? But
and in his walking and talking, he actually looks more spry than the American president. In some
I'm not
ways.
going to respond to that.
Who's a couple of years younger than he is. But a couple of things. Without getting overly technical, do you think a designated supreme leader has already been picked? Or do you think we will be as surprised this time around as we were last time around when Khomeini passed away and some guy was picked that none of us expected?
Yeah, and Ali Khamenei.
Yes.
Who, of course, the year before Khomeini passed away, Khomeini was very critical of him and chastised him publicly for misunderstanding his own ideological legacy.
Right.
And sent a letter saying, you don't understand what I'm talking about here.
Very publicly.
Very publicly.
Very
said,
public.
I didn't say that. Here's what I said.
Right.
So this is quite remarkable. And so a lot of speculation about who will succeed Ali Khamenei, Mujtaba, his son. I don't think in any way it's a done deal.
Right.
This is more a gut feeling and how I feel about sort of how that the appointing the son would really look really bad.
Right.
And so I tend to think that it's not a done deal at all. But it has to do something with the internal forces and the balance of forces within the regime itself. And there's going to be a real struggle. The succession issue back in 88, 89 was a fundamental moment, critical juncture in Iran's history. And this will also be, because in many respects, the whole system hinges not simply on the authority of the so-called supreme leader or the Rahbar, the leader, but on his ability to balance out these different forces. And one of the strange paradoxes of trying to exclude alternative forces such as the reformists and more of the kind of traditional conservatives, it's not just the reformists, but more traditional conservatives, is that the regime increasingly is hitching its future to a smaller array of political actors. And that's a constraint for the regime. And that's a constraint for the ability of the next leader to play this balancing act as well. And so to some extent, the more you exclude from the circle of leadership, the harder it is to sort of maintain that same sort of game, whereby the supreme leader's power comes from the ability to manipulate all these groups. So the regime, the success of the hardliners, and Khomeini's effort to sort of put into place a set of institutional arrangements and leaders who will really assure his legacy could create real dilemmas for the regime to come, because, you know, in light of the protests that have taken place over the year, more than a year now, the regime knows, and I wrote about this most recently in the piece I just published a couple of weeks ago. The supreme leader talks at length about the alienation of the youth, how they're not interested in participating. He blames the West for that. He constantly, of course, says this is a consequence of U.S. actions and so on, but I think he understands how much of Iranian society is completely disillusioned with the notion of an Islamic state, right?
Right.
And that's a real dilemma, and he needs, in some sense, a bridge, and the bridge is the reformists. And they've been discredited among themselves as well. They're split, they're divided in their own ranks, they're exhausted. There's no obvious solution to the dilemma that repression and exclusion has created for the regime itself. And that's, you know, it's just yet another dilemma that will play out. And in that context, it's not inconceivable that elements within the IRGC, the Islamic Guard, the Revolutionary Guard, will say, you know, we just need our guy in there. And Mujtaba is the guy, and he's going to be, you know, and that would change the nature of the regime. Mm-hmm. That would change the nature of how the regime operates, to have that kind of change within it. So that's why my gut tells me that the leadership wouldn't be as unimaginative, let's put it that way, to sort of solve their problem by appointing the son the next supreme leader. But one lesson I think you'll agree with on this is, Iranian politics always surprises us, right?
Exactly.
You've got to be prepared for the unexpected, because when you think you've figured it out, and suddenly you haven't, right? Nobody would have expected the election of Khatami, for example.
Right.
So the resilience of the society, the capacity for mobilization, the tension within these different factions in the regime constantly is creating this sort of possibility for things that you can't necessarily predict. My late father used to say he would predict only things that have occurred already. And that's the kind of prediction he would stick to. And you know, it's that way in Iran, because we could be seeing a different sort of policy. I'll just end here. I mean, one thing that has made it much more difficult for the reformists to sort of advance their cause is not only the constant power and resistance of the hardliners, so-called, but also the fact that the one thing that the hardliners don't want is reconciliation with the United States. For them, rapprochement with the United States would be a strategic defeat. And they've done their best to prevent it, but we've also had leadership from Washington, which has also contributed to the problem by not taking advantage of openings, and that was true under Khatami as well. And that has only created a situation where the hardliners they've been strengthened, because one thing they do not want is to see any kind of end to the conflict with the United States. They need the conflict, and they need to contain it at the same time.
Perfect. Thank you. I'm tempted to ask and ask and ask, but we would be here all night. Thank you very much. Please join me in thanking Daniel Brumberg. Thank you so much, Daniel. Really appreciate it. Terrific.
Thanks.
Thank you.